welcome to Doors Open Days 220. Here we are in Bannockburn House in the main hall of the 17th century building. The house itself, the main house itself, is a Grade A listed mansion house. It's of an H-shaped formation with two equal wings on each side. The hall isn't as it would have appeared in the 17th century when it was built by this gentleman, Sir Hugh Patterson. However, the ladies that are on the wall behind me would still have seen the house looking very similar in the 18th century when they visited around the time of Bonnie Prince Charlie. We'll tell you a bit more about that later. Now, this young lady behind me on the left is Clementina Walkinshaw, who was the lady love of the famous Bonnie Prince Charlie, reputed to have began the romance within this house in January 1746. The pretty young lady in the middle is her daughter Charlotte. The lady on the right is the grandmother, Lady Barrowfield of Glasgow, the mother of Clementina. So this is 3 generations of the one family. Gentleman to my rear is Sir Hugh Patterson, the owner of the house when Bonnie Prince Charlie visited, the most noted of the 3 Sir Hughs linked to the house. Lady Barrowfield here is Sir Hugh's sister. The house itself, as I said, is the 17th century mansion house. The first Sir Hugh Patterson completed the house around 1675. Around that time he also commissioned the fabulous ceiling that we see above our heads beyond Robert's flags. Now this ceiling is very similar and is likened to the ceilings within Holyrood Palace, bearing in mind they are of the same age. It is believed that the craftsman who did the ceilings in Holyrood Palace also came to Bannockburn House and did this ceiling and the ceiling in the other room you will see in another video. The blue ceiling. The reason these ceilings were procured through these craftsmen is that Sir Hugh Patterson was a writer to the signet, so he was high up in the royal court of Charles II in the 1670s. The house has gone through some turbulent times, notwithstanding 1715 and 1745 Jacobite risings, which is this connection with all the portraits here that we've got displayed in the hall. The Patterson family held the house through 3 generations until the 1780s. The last Sir Hugh, to my back here, died in the 1780s, leaving the house to his lone surviving heir, Mary Patterson, his daughter. Unfortunately, the family fortunes were in very poor state, and Mary sold the house at that point, and it went to the family of William Ramsay of Barrington. Now, William Ramsay of Barrington was at one time noted as the richest commoner in Scotland. At the time he bought Bannockburn House, the previous year he had bought Sauchieburn Estate and the accompanying house, which is just bordering over to the east of the house, and he also owned the very rich Barrington Estate in Edinburgh. The plan was that his 2 sons would have an estate and property to inherit on his death. However, out of these 3 grand houses that the Ramsays owned, Bannockburn House is the only one still standing. The Ramsays owned the properties until the 1880s. It fell through different generations. The Ramsay family, again, tragedy seemed to follow in their wake, and a lot of short-lived heirs throughout, ending up with the Ramsay Gibson Maitland family. And this gentleman we can talk about on another occasion with relation to the birth of Scottish aquaculture locally. Now, however, the house was then sold in 1883 to Colonel Alexander Wilson of the famous Wilsons of Bannockburn and the Tartan family. Hopefully people will know about that by now. Again, we can speak about that on another occasion. Now, the Wilsons bought the house in 1883. Colonel Wilson actually lived in the house as a tenant for roughly 20 years although the Ramsay family had owned the house throughout from the 1787 onwards, they didn't actually occupy it as a home. So it was tenanted out to different people throughout that period. Now, Colonel Wilson held the house until he passed away. The house was sold in 1910 to the Mitchell family. The Mitchell family held the house until 1962. Again, tragedy followed in their wake, and again it was a sole female heir who inherited the house in the 1920s on the death of her father, her two brothers having predeceased her. One who very famously possibly received the Croix de Guerre after the Battle of the Somme in World War I. Her other brother died in 1921, we think maybe due to injuries received during World War I, as both brothers served their country in World War I. So the surviving heir was a Miss Annie Mitchell, who was very, very prominent in the local community, very prominent in the local church, the Ladywell Church, a benefactor of the church, so much so that when the new church was built in the New Hill Park estate, ironically, where a Wilson house had once stood, she laid the foundation stone for that new church in Hill Park, in Morrison Drive in Hill Park, in around 1957 and 1958. As I say, she was very much a benefactor, very prominent in the local community, very prominent in ward work during World War II. We'll have some information about that elsewhere, so please come and visit us at some point in the future once we can open again, and we'll be able to share some more stories surrounding Miss Mitchell. Here we are in the room we affectionately call the Mitchell Library. So called because Annie Mitchell, who I mentioned earlier, we know this was one of her favourite rooms, and when she was still in here, this was used as her library. Again, it's a very sunny room, as you can see, with the bay windows, and we have lots of stories about her use of the room. We have a plaque which celebrates and notes James T.R. Mitchell's service record. There are also some other pictures in this room that show the Wilson family who were prior to the Mitchells, Colonel Wilson and his children, as well as a few other people related to the house. Now, after Miss Mitchell sold the house in 1962, she moved into a smaller house in Stirling in Snowdon Place. I mean, obviously this large mansion house had become too large for one single lady and a few servants. Now, the gentleman that bought the house at that time was a very eccentric Glasgow businessman named Albert Ernest Pickard. Now, he was very famous in Glasgow. If anyone's heard of the Glasgow Penobscot Theatre, this was actually very, very famous and run by Mr. Pickard in the 1910s and 1920s onwards. He was a very rich man, a millionaire, and however, when he bought the house in 1962, we don't know what he planned to do with the house. Unfortunately, he died very sadly in a house fire 2 years later, and then the mansion house and property was in probate for some years until the late 1970s, and then the house was sold to a Mr. Peter Drake, who the trust bought the house from in December 2017. Now, Mr. Pickard was also famous for the music halls, theatres, and he was also a massive property owner. At one point, noted to be this, second only to Glasgow Corporation. However, the eccentricity comes through because we've heard many tales of his doings in Glasgow throughout the decades. Driving around Glasgow in his Rolls Royce with a TV aerial on the roof of his car because he wanted to have a TV set in the back. Doing lots of different things like abandoning his car on the station platform at Central Station as he was late to catch a train for a trip down the water, and being the first person to receive a fine for parking as so. lots of different things related to this man, and we're now finding out more and more stories, and we've had a link to some of his descendants recently who visited the house with us, so we hope to hear more stories in the future.
No, no, no.